I will go ahead and thank you so much for having me. I know people are trickling in, so I'll just take a moment to introduce myself and round that out, mainly because I know that people are here from all around the world and some from closer to home at Northeastern. Either way, we're eager in our new center, which is called the Burns Center for Social Change, to build collaborations and want to invite you and encourage you to reach out to us. Just to kind of round out what Ricardo was saying, the Burns Center is the Northeastern University's new university-wide center focused on social change. So a large part of what we do is to teach people the skills of making social change happen in the digital age, which requires, I would argue, a hefty knowledge of data, AI, and especially machine learning. And then we also have faculty and staff and students who are affiliated with us who work on making change happen in specific areas. So one of our partner project areas is the lab that I've run for the last 10 years, which is called the Gov Lab. So my own work focuses centrally on ways in which public institutions, governments at every level, can and are using technology to affect social change, to solve public problems, and to restore and deepen democracy. And so that connects to the talk that I want to give today. But I did want to put in a little shout out and just a public service announcement for this center, since it's brand new. And the website only went up really a few weeks ago, and we're eager for collaborators and talking to anyone and everyone who is interested in implementing real world change. So let me dive in, and I'm thrilled to kick off the series this year, and this might be a little different than some of the talks that are coming up. When I told my team that I was giving this talk today, I of course got the immediate reaction from people: who still has to give a talk? Why is GPT-3 not writing your talk for you and DALL-E creating your slides and images? So I'm glad to see that there are still humans involved in giving these talks. But if you were to look at the media, especially in the fields that I come from, I'm originally trained in law, although I have been and was an engineering professor at NYU for the last 10 years. But my original field is law, and I spent a lot of time in public administration. Most of the conversation that you see, of course, is about the dangers of AI. It's not about the hopeful opportunities, and it's much more about the risks of AI, the ways in which we are worried that AI will be used for discriminatory purposes, to deprive people of their rights and liberties, to send people back to prison using bad risk recidivism algorithms, for example. We're very worried about the forms of bias and discrimination that are creeping in. And you're all very conversant with these conversations, and I'm sure many of you are working on bias in AI in many different guises and respects. But most of the people that kind of come from the world of public administration or law tend to focus a lot on these questions of regulation of AI and the ways in which we can avoid the kinds of biases that are creeping in. I happen to also hold a role in government, working for the state of New Jersey as the Chief Innovation Officer. I know that we're right now in the process of promulgating new regulations against the use of algorithmic hiring tools because of the concerns about what algorithmic hiring does for diversity, or better put, doesn't do for diversity, and the discrimination that creeps in. So this is a lot of the headlines that we tend to see, and it powers a lot of the policy focus and policy making and attention, and also research investments are around these questions of mitigating bias. So you might have seen this op-ed and the work that's being put out by OSTP out of the White House, which again is very much focused again on responsible uses of AI and concerns about the way the tech industry is doing and building innovative things, but the innovation may at the same time be very socially deleterious. So you may have seen this book from 3 Stanford professors, Mehran Sahami, Rob Reich, and Jeremy Weinstein, called System Error, that came out a couple of months ago, in which they essentially lamented the tendency of engineers and technologists towards optimization, and the lack of focus on the social good. Okay, so that's one part of the story, and that's where I think a lot of the oxygen gets taken up in terms of debates. There is, however, a growing, I think, attention and interest in the opportunities that AI creates to help make governing more efficient and more effective. So instead of just focusing on the ways that we govern AI, there's a question of how we can use AI for governing. And that's where there is, again, new attention from groups like Nesta. This is, I forgot the source here on this image, but you have places like Harvard and the Ash Center that's put out this report on the ways in which artificial intelligence, here's another one from the Partnership for Public Service, again, talking about the ways in which we can use AI and machine learning to make the work of public servants more efficient and to make service delivery for citizens better in new ways. Brookings did a recent report and an event focused on uses of AI. This was Darrell West's work on how to reduce government fraud. And we see projects coming out of places like both Brazil and Canada that are using the computational power of AI to do things like spot fraud, waste, and abuse in spending patterns and bring down the costs of government. Lots of uses, of course, of natural language processing and optical character recognition to do things like sort the mail. In my own group, the Gov Lab, we've been tracking how cities are using AI in really, really interesting ways. And there are, again, lots of these stories of government efficiency being realized through the greater use of AI and machine learning. But there's a last part to this story that I would argue gets very, very little focus and needs much more attention. And that is the ways in which we can use AI and machine learning, not simply, again, the questions of how do we regulate them, not the questions of how we use AI and machine learning for governing, but the subset really in this governance question of how we can use AI to deepen and strengthen participatory democracy, or what some researchers like to call collective intelligence, which is just another word for public engagement using more technology. So the intersection between artificial intelligence and collective intelligence, I would argue, is a very important interdisciplinary area that requires more attention and more focus. So it allows us to ask the question about the ways in which technology can help us to make new forms of collaboration, co-design, and deliberation, to reinvent and reimagine how we've thought about democracy. Lots of great examples about technology more generally making participation more effective. So last year, 2 years ago during COVID, together with the Federation of American Scientists, I launched a project called Ask a Scientist, where we crowdsourced a network of some 600 PhD level scientists to provide real-time answers to people's questions about COVID. Or just to take another example, the city of Helsinki is collaborating with hundreds of people across businesses, university experts, but also thousands of residents now, to crowdsource and identify 147 climate goals, to identify the data to track performance of those goals and to hold government accountable for those purposes. I could give you more examples, like how in Louisville, they're working with residents to gather data about instances of asthma inhaler usage, and thereby use that crowdsourced citizen science data to bring down rates of asthma inhaler usage by over 85% as a result of the better data collection. So those are just three sort of random examples, but meant to kind of spark this question: what if we could, in fact, build and foster a stronger, more participatory democracy in which we were able to really connect people and their know-how, whether it's the ordinary person on the street, whether it's the data scientist or the public health expert, whether we can connect people with various forms of expertise to public officials and enable public officials to take advantage of that collective intelligence, of the wisdom of and insights of the communities of which we're a part, to build a stronger democracy, but also to solve problems in more effective ways. So the broader question is whether we can reimagine democracy beyond voting, beyond simply the idea of the once-a-year trip to the polling booth, and to think about the ways in which we might create institutions that are able to engage in systematic conversations with residents, with experts, again, in our own backyard and around the world. But the challenge of doing that, the challenge of building more participatory democracy, of building, we could talk about different flavors of participation, which we will in a moment. The challenge has always been one of efficiency. It's always been one of scale. It's very, very hard to organize. There's a lot of great will out there to engage residents. There's a lot of lip service paid to concepts of participation and engagement, but frankly, it's just very hard for people to do. They don't have enough hours in the day, they don't have enough time, and they don't have the processes that can allow people to engage in large-scale conversations. So I think what AI does above all, and where we need to spend our time and energy, is on focusing on how we reinvigorate participatory democracy using AI. So I would say there are 6 ways in which, at least in the first instance, AI provides us with better tools for fostering new forms of democratic engagement and advancing the kind of democratic engagement that we've done in the past. So I want to start first with some examples of kind of incrementally how we could improve what we do. But the thing I hope you're thinking about in the back of mind is how we can fundamentally and radically re-envision what we're doing all together to go beyond some of the practices we have today. So as some of you may know, since 1946 in the United States, we have had the right as members of the public to participate in the process of reviewing regulatory rules before they're passed. So Congress passes, and this Congress especially, a very small number of pieces of legislation. At the moment, we pass fewer pieces of legislation every year than at any time in history, so in recent years. Something on the order of 200, 300, 400 pieces of legislation. But regulatory agencies pass thousands of regulations that govern everything from, how cleanliness in our air, of our water, how wide the doorway needs to be in order for a wheelchair to pass through, you name it. The challenge with these rulemakings, though, whereas most of the time the problem is that nobody knows about the right to participate and nobody gets involved, sometimes we have the problem that too many people participate. So you may have followed the rulemakings around things like net neutrality a few years ago, or maybe when the Forest Service put out rules about snowmobiles in national parks. There's very often something that captures media attention and the public imagination, and then you get millions of comments pouring into federal agencies. Well, there is no hope that a government official on the other end is going to be able to actually read those millions of comments. And it doesn't help anything that those comments are very often duplicative. So there have been uses of AI in recent years to deduplicate those comments and ensure that we can at least take that volume of what might seem to be a million comments and at least begin to just sort out the original comments that are actually worth reading in order to reduce the workload on the agency official. So this problem, and I'm just showing some visual examples here of some of these deduplication efforts, but there are these groups like Dedupe.io or like Discover Text who are in the business of deduplicating large quantities of content that are hopefully, if we can get more agencies to use these tools, and that's not the case yet, that can help us to make the process of citizen commenting more efficient and thereby more meaningful, to make it more relevant when someone is participating. At the same time, then a lot of these tools are useful for things like summarization, which can again be helpful in terms of enabling and empowering other kinds of citizen participation processes. So the Department of State did a public engagement. This was not a rulemaking. This was just going on the web and asking people for help reimagining what the passport application process should look like. Naturally, lots of people wrote in. and offering their feedback on how they thought the passport application process should be made better. But of course, typically when you have these kinds of processes and you give people a box in which to comment, you get what you would expect. Off-topic, voluminous comments, all kinds of things that are useless. And so there's been lots of experiments now, like the one that the Passport Office engaged in this case with an Israeli company that they partnered with, but there's other projects, as you know better than I do, involved in trying to augment text summarization tools, which we could be putting to use in order to create more effective commenting processes and thereby be able to summarize more effectively what people are typing in. Let me keep going because I think you'll get a sense of the flavor here. The next area in which I think AI techniques are beginning to be helpful, again, the incremental improvements that we're seeing that are being put to use in limited circumstances for improving the way citizens participate in governance, is in the area of sentiment analysis. So some of you may be familiar with Deb Roy's work in his lab at the MIT Media Lab. He has a project called Cortico. It's also called the Local Voices Network, or the technology is called Cortico, and then the application is called the Local Voices Network, where they're using AI to essentially enable the analysis, summarization of large-scale deliberative conversations, or I should say real-time deliberative conversations. So the device sits on the table, records conversations among citizens. Again, this before COVID was done around a table, now done more via Zoom, but allows people to engage in traditional forms of deliberation, but takes the content coming out of that deliberation and allows it to be analyzed and synthesized and made sense of more rapidly to make deliberative conversations more efficient and more effective. So it's creating the promise that we might be able to use citizen deliberation, in this case, so not typing comments on a rule or typing a response to a website project like the State Department one, but enabling residents, especially people who don't command the written language very well, to be able just to engage in a spoken conversation and to analyze what they're talking about in order to make that information easier to make sense of, easier to process. Zen City is an Israeli company that does sentiment analysis for government. It's a related kind of work. This is a commercial project, and it's a little more aimed not at policymakers, but at communications officials. It's pitched to mayors in a sense, as a way of getting, as it says here, take the heartbeat of your community. So they're looking at Twitter and other social media, what people are saying about their city, what people are saying about city services, and trying to essentially distill that for a better intelligence and input for city managers to enable people to get a pulse on what citizens say. So this is a little bit more passive form of citizen engagement. Citizens are not necessarily even have to be aware of the fact that they're giving input to government. They may just be online complaining about motor vehicles, complaining about the line for their COVID vaccine. Government, however, can gain insights from that. But if we look at something like Cortico, it sort of marries a lot of the same techniques in sentiment analysis that a Zen City is using, but it marries it to a more active deliberation process where residents are very affirmatively engaging in deliberation, engaging in participation. And especially as many, many jurisdictions around the world, especially in places like France and elsewhere, are turning to the use of deliberative mini publics, that is to say, taking a representative sample of citizens and asking them to sit around a table, real or virtual, and deliberate about a democratic issue. This is a really, really interesting potential. We could talk about Ricardo's from Chile, which just went through a process now of a referendum around its constitution, but prior to that was crowdsourcing input on its new constitutional draft, which it's done before, as Iceland has done. this creates many new interesting possibilities for how we can think about taking citizen engagement and deliberation, which has always been something it's been very, very difficult to scale, and making it really scalable, useful, and efficient. Then there's tools for annotation. And of course, we've seen lots of uses of annotation, whether it's something like a rap genius or something like a hypothesis. But it opens up a new opportunity, I think, for, again, thinking about how we can process information in new ways. For those of you who are focused on this from a machine learning and a AI perspective, some of these are many of the same techniques from a technical perspective. But they turn out to be very different strategies from a governance perspective or a democratic engagement perspective. So here, the example of the federal government in Germany promulgated a few years ago its new federal government strategy on AI. My group at the Gov Lab and the Harvard Berkman Center collaborated to essentially get the government, and the hardest part here was not the technology, it was persuading the government to release the strategy in draft. And to crowdsource annotation on that strategy, where we reached out to AI experts around the world. Maybe one of you actually participated in this process to provide feedback to the government, and then to help the government actually make sense of that feedback again quickly and efficiently so that they could incorporate it into what eventually became the final design of the project that they launched. So there's lots of interesting experiments now. FactMatter really attempts to marry AI and machine learning to these processes of community annotation, which create new opportunities for thinking about how do you marry a document or a policy document to an engagement process, and again, make that a more collaborative process. We might think about this, and again, there's many overlaps between these categories because they're all different forms of really information processing. But I would separately designate the category or talk about the idea of sorting and organization of information as being its own distinct kind of its own distinct thing. I realize here I have a slide which is about the wrong Citizen Lab. This is not this next slide is about Citizen Lab, but there's two Citizen Labs. There is a company out of Brussels that makes open source software for citizen engagement. That is the Citizen Lab I'm referring to, and not the Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto. I need to be very clear about that. In fact, there's legal action between the two of them over the name, so my apologies for the confusion about the slide there. But Citizen Lab in Brussels is working with 100 different cities around the world, including in the United States, using open source software. What they do is not to help so much, they do those things too with annotation and with commenting, but what they're providing back is essentially this kind of clustering, this kind of topic modeling, which allows government officials, let me go back, to make sense of the feedback that they're seeing, and to show that same feedback back to residents so that people can understand, as part of a deliberative conversation, where do people's opinions tend to cluster? Where is what is the information that's coming in that's of interest to people? And these kinds of tools are becoming especially useful now in different forms of what I like to call crowd law, or uses of technology to foster citizen participation, specifically in lawmaking processes. So you have examples like Taiwan, that has engaged 250,000 people in the crafting and drafting of legislation using a series of open source tools, some of which incorporate AI. So they use a tool called Polis to do very similar kinds of clustering, to enable both residents and government to see how people's opinions diverge, how they converge, where views are, and allows them to organize a fairly complex, both online and face-to-face process, but that they have sort of gotten down into a template and been able to engage citizens in crafting and drafting what has now become 26 pieces of enacted legislation, including on such issues as Uber and ride-sharing services, telemedicine, and online alcohol sales. Another open source project is the nonprofit Your Priorities, like Polis, both open source nonprofit projects. Your Priorities is a project of the Citizens Foundation out of Iceland, which builds tools for resident engagement that increasingly use AI to do exactly this kind of clustering. I've used this kind of tool myself in a variety of projects, and Northeastern is using it right now in a collaboration we're doing between the City of Oakland, the Oakland Social Innovation Fund, Mills College, formerly now Mills College at Northeastern, and residents across Oakland and around the world, to ask residents to propose ideas for solutions to urban challenges. So we're asking people, what are their good ideas for how to solve challenges of gun violence, of homelessness, and other important urban issues, using this kind of tool to allow people to engage, but then importantly, using simple forms of machine learning to allow us to cluster what we hear from people, to summarize what we hear from people, and to automate the process to make it more efficient and more effective. Your Priorities has been used in at least 20,000 different engagements everywhere in the world, from Chile to Scotland, to Vienna. I was just looking at a project yesterday, and Oakland, where it's being really used to organize new forms of resident engagement. So lastly, and really as a kind of catch-all, it's helping us to engage in new forms of collaboration and coordination, allowing us to think about new ways of organizing collective intelligence in ways that we haven't really been able to do before. And therefore, I hope in allowing us to go beyond the ballot box, to thinking about engagement as something that we only do once a year, to allow us to reimagine new forms of participation. And this is where we really have to think about not just ways that we incrementally make progress on making regulatory rulemaking a little bit more efficient, or making typical comment processes a little bit better and more efficient, or enable people to engage in the same kind of deliberative dialogue that they've done for 1,000 years, but just to make it a little bit easier to understand. All those things I think are important and transformative, and we have a long way to go to even begin to incorporate even these simple things into regular practice. But at the same time, I think we want to look further ahead. We want to imagine what are the new things that we can do to think about new forms of swarm intelligence, as unanimous AI does, that could allow us to think about governance in radically new and different ways. You may be familiar with some of the work of Cesar Hidalgo, who's now at Toulouse, used to be at MIT. He had a project at one point that he called Augmented Democracy, which essentially talked about having your AI agent who knows your preferences and your views better than you do, essentially represent you and vote for you. That's a very simplistic description. If anybody's on here who knows the project deeply, we can get into a deeper conversation about it. I'm not doing it justice. But it essentially is a kind of radical and bold re-envisioning of democracy. Whether it's the right re-envisioning or not is up for debate. But I would say that there's lots of things we need to think about, ways in which we could radically re-envision what democracy means, what participation means, and what deliberation mean as a result of the tools that are now available to us. In the immediate term, though, we have some use cases that I think we can focus on, and I want to get in them as I close out to a use case that I want to put to you and get your feedback on. But let me say in the first place, there's a number of things that we might think about, and I'm happy to brainstorm any of these, ways in which, for example, we could use AI to enable people at scale to define problems together. So let me give you an example of this. Just recently in my work in New Jersey, we were thinking about what kinds of policies we needed, what sort of rules and laws and spending we needed to address issues of the impact of technology on work. So I was chair of the state's Future of Work Task Force. And what we did was we went out to workers in the state and we asked people, what do you think are the greatest challenges? What are the greatest threats that you see from technology to the future of work? We wanted to be able to make policies that were responsive to what people actually were concerned about, instead of thinking we knew what people actually cared about. And so we heard from 6,000 people in a matter of about 2 weeks. We did something very similar together with a foundation and again with another government, focused on asking parents and students and teachers what were the greatest challenges they faced as a result of COVID for their education. So that in order to target our scarce resources, in order to target how we spent money and what we made policy around, that we would actually be responsive to what people's concerns were. Doing that at scale, really hearing from people in ways that are scalable and in ways that are also truly representative, is a really interesting problem that I think machine learning can help us with. I've talked quite a bit about ways in which we could enable deliberation at scale. So the notion of really active forms of participation where people sit together in the church basement or the school cafeteria, or nowadays around Zoom or Teams, the ways in which we might have conversations at scale. I've used a commercial platform called Remesh, which is very much designed to be able to do deliberation at scale using machine learning to essentially enable very, very rapid analysis of what people are saying. And it's a really interesting and promising platform that begins to explore this question of how do we have large-scale conversations. Remesh, because it's a commercial company, is mostly focused on helping to do focus groups for companies so that they can understand whether Coke versus Pepsi and this ad versus that ad. We need a lot more work at enabling democratic deliberation, not simply corporate focus groups. I'm going to skip over number 3 because I'm going to come to that last. Lots of discussion, including a discussion that we hosted with Congress this past year, interest in how to help lawmakers analyze data faster, how to help lawmakers get smarter faster. And now there is a new innovation lab within Congress. They're giving a talk tomorrow that I'm going to. They're hiring technologists. They're desperately looking for expertise to be able to implement new innovations to enable Congress to do better data analysis in connection with lawmaking. And then, of course, there's lots of experiments now with what we might call co-creation or new forms of collaboration between citizens and governments to whether it's engage in a hackathon or develop a project together. Again, very robust forms of democratic participation, but very hard for governments to organize a collaboration at scale and co-creation at scale that could enable the participatory solving of problems that would, again, both lead to more efficient solutions to problems while also building more legitimacy. And finally, let me close with one last example, which is one that, two last things that we're working on most immediately that I want to put to you. One is we are not going to get adoption of new forms of AI and machine learning in governments especially, and especially not for citizen engagement, unless people actually know what AI is. So we run a project that we call Innovate US, or our Innovation Skills Accelerator, where we are teaching new technology to government officials, as well as teaching people how to work in new ways using data, using human-centered design. This is for the first 4 months of the project. We trained over 1,000 people. We're running regular workshops, and now we have some grant funding to scale our training in AI and responsible AI and machine learning to public servants. We're not going to, again, we need public servants who are better customers for AI and machine learning, without which we won't be able to, I think, make these innovations. Lastly, and the project that I want to leave you with is the third use case I had on the slide before. So we've been doing a lot of work to use technology to foster engagement among people with useful know-how to help in solving problems. We call this smarter crowdsourcing. Essentially, it's something we've been doing for many, many years to get experts together from around the world online to be able to offer solutions, whether it's to foundations or to policymakers about solutions to problems. As I mentioned, this last year, we did a project for the Congressional Committee on Modernization, where we crowdsourced expertise from hundreds of experts to help Congress think about how it could use data more effectively. The project was written up in the Boston Globe a couple of months ago. Now we're thinking about how do we put this process on steroids. We started this process by essentially using a lot of a friend techniques to find the experts that we invite to this. We've, over the years, started to adopt more efficient and data-driven search techniques for finding people with the right know-how, whether it's looking at citation networks, whether it's looking at patents and publications, whether it's looking at social media. We're using a lot of data-driven sources to identify experts. But it begs the question of how we might use new forms of AI to enable us to automate the process of finding experts and connecting them to policymakers and decision makers. So as we look ahead as the Burns Center now to embark on a new initiative around solutions journalism, that is to say, to be able to scale our work of finding solutions out there, we are very, very interested in ways in which we can scale the process of finding experts and being able to connect experts, not just to policymakers, but to journalists and to funders, to be able to, again, accelerate the process of finding solutions that work, funding those processes, and talking about them. So I want to close with the question back to you of research that you might be familiar with, interests that you might have, or ideas that come to mind or people to recommend as we start to embark on this process of thinking about how do we take this smarter crowdsourcing effort and really make it scale and make it sing by enable us to automate the process of finding experts. Happy to say more about that in the discussion, but let me end my slides and turn it over to you and see what comments, questions, and reactions there are.
Thank you, Beth. A great presentation of many problems that should trigger a lot of research. We are, in some sense, working on what we call IR 3.0, which is a combination of basically deep learning and knowledge bases, and that may be useful for expert research. So we may help in the future. So there are many questions, but I would like to give the first question to someone not from Northeastern. So do you want to do the question yourself, Ayan, Paul? And thank you for coming because I have seen you in many seminars. Ayan, are you there?
Oh, hi, yeah. So, yeah, I am actually in Northeastern. I'm in Experiential AI postdoc. So, the question basically is that NLP is good for gathering popular sentiments, but like any other machine learning or statistical learning method, it is bad for detecting outliers, which are often misclassified or incorrectly clustered. This is a particular problem when dealing with minority opinion. How would you deal with this, and how much of a problem is this?
Can you just repeat the very first thing you said is not very good at finding outliers? I just didn't hear the first word, the first three words that you said because you were unmuted.
Okay. So basically the idea is that any machine learning method or statistical learning method is really bad at finding outliers, and NLP suffers from the same. So it's good at collecting popular sentiments, but much of there could be sentiments which are outliers, and this would be minority sentiments. And these can be misclassified or incorrectly clustered. How would you deal with that?
Yeah, so I think this gets to a broader point, which is not relying on one form of input for any kind of process. You see whether it's flaws in the technology or flaws among humans. When you tend to put up any form of participation process that is self-selected, who participates, you get biases in terms of who shows up. So Estonia ran a process to engage residents online in providing ideas for how to reform their political process after some scandals that happened there. And so the people who showed up were outliers in the sense that they were all, wealthy middle-aged men. And so you didn't get a very representative sample. So then they combined it with a selection process where they then invited a representative sample of citizens to for a complementary process that provided a different perspective. So similarly, in these kinds of sentiment analysis processes, sentiment, things that rely on kind of sentiment analysis, you have both this outlier problem, and then you have the challenge of, again, the kind of self-selection problem, and then the who's online problem, and then a lot of concerns about sort of this being I mean, I'm a big fan of these passive processes because they're really cheap. They're really easy. They don't create a lot of work for anybody. So I think they're great to do, but we shouldn't rely on them as the only form of information, on which we base a decision necessarily. But I think it's a wonderful guidepost. For example, let's take, so I did a project on sentiment analysis with the New York City Council a couple of years ago. And when you look at all the flaws to one side, look at the way they currently make policy. They currently make policy by some city council member hears something on the radio or gets a complaint from a constituent or reads something in the paper and then goes, oh, we need to make a rule about that. So the prioritization of issues is driven by all the wrong things. Or another favorite example of mine, you may have heard on the news yesterday, they said students in California are getting up later because start times in California, thanks to new legislation that was passed a year or two ago, school starts now at 8:30 in California. That legislation is the result of an op-ed that a legislator read in the LA Times based on some research, good research, about why kids need more sleep. But that legislation happened because that guy happened to read the paper that morning and see that study from the American Association of Pediatrics or whoever it was. It's great, but we shouldn't be prioritizing policy making based on like whatever someone happens to see in the paper, or worse yet, what someone with money says is the most important thing. So let me stop talking and just say that flaws, yes, and I think we need to improve this edge detection problem, but if we can do both, if we can do multiple forms of engagement, it's so much better than what we're doing now. Sorry, I'm going to stop talking, but it's a great question.
Thank you very much.
So there's another question on sentiment analysis. We may continue with that. John Ortega, you want to do it yourself? John?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Ricardo. Yeah, so thanks for the talk, by the way, Beth. This was really good stuff. Also, I love everything that you talked about here. It's in the sense of you've covered several different facets of where we could even think about applying NLP. But one of the first things that caught my attention was the talk about sentiment analysis and how it's being applied. And I've seen this in the courses that I've taught and the students that I've taught. Oftentimes it's almost as if it were a marketing term, and it sounds really good. But when you look at it from behind the scenes and I think Paul was touching on this a little bit, when you look at it from behind the scenes, it's a tough problem. And I think oftentimes businesses and managers are sold on that stuff. But at the end of the day, what means success to them? Like when you hear that a business seems to somehow, gotten some type of advantage over sentiment analysis, what spells success?
Well, it's a great question, and that's what I worry about. So when we talk to the city council, they were so interested in this kind of information gathering, but then this gets back to the question that was asked before, the question about how much you should rely on what you're hearing, and how much what do you do with this information? And that's why, Zen City is selling this as a service, and what's under the hood, I don't know, but I bet you it's nothing very complicated, but to essentially say to social media managers and government and communications professionals, like, here's the general, people are complaining about your motor vehicle, how long the line is at motor vehicles. So I think we have to be very careful about how much we rely on this as a sole form of input. if for no other reason than if it's just based on Twitter, you know, there are a lot of people who are not on Twitter. And so what kind of sense we need to make of it, I think is part of this education process around teaching people about how much to weight the value of different forms of input using AI. But again, at the same time, it is such a great channel of information that's not being leveraged. Something as simple as, you know, just just a very random thing that comes to mind. During COVID and this work in New Jersey that I do, we started a newsletter with a feedback channel. And it was the first time, you know, and overnight we went from literally 0 to 2 million subscriptions. And that's 2 million more people that we're in conversation with, giving them a button to say, please let us know, you know, please send us information, etc. So, you know, it's just having the ability to make sense of it. When we first did this, when I was in the Obama administration, we asked people for their input on the agenda for the Obama administration's first 100 days. And we heard from 85,000 people in like 4 days. And of course, we were wildly unprepared for this. We had, and to be honest, you know, none of this feedback was used because we had no ability to make sense of it. We didn't know what to do with it. We didn't know how to rely on it. So all that to say, I think there's a lot of work to do in this space to help people really understand what's the value of this information, how to make sense of it, how to rely on it, and as well as to improve the tools at the same time. So yes, and.
Ben, do you like to continue?
Yeah, thanks for an interesting talk. I'm sorry if there's some noise in the background. I was just interested in, it seems like a lot of the examples that you pointed to are really great for increasing the quality of participation for people that are participating. I wonder if there's examples of how AI might be able to expand access, and that seems like particularly important because if the venue requires technological resources, if you need to be online, if you need to have a phone, et cetera, that seems like it's potentially adds another barrier. So I wonder if you have thoughts on that, if you've seen research or work on.
So I think we can put the information have-nots issue to one side for a moment, in the sense that if we were to throw our hands up and say not everybody is online, you know, if we just said not everybody is online, and that caused us to stop creating ways for people to participate until everybody can participate, I think we would miss a lot of opportunity to get to people, most of whom have mobile phones. So I think the penetration rates are in such a place that the digital divide issue isn't what should be stopping us. However, our ability to use AI to actually target participation is, to me, the next really interesting frontier. So this gets to your point about it. So participation is not just about how simple the interface is or what techniques we use for doing this kind of digital listening. It's for making people aware of the opportunity to participate, which is, I think, what you're getting at. So that's why I'm really interested in this question of targeting and how you can use things like, and here I'm going to be out of my depth computationally, but, you know, I've talk to people like David Bly about bag of words techniques and other forms of topic modeling and ways in which we can help to connect people based on their interest and expertise and credentials and training, like what different sources of information we can use, getting beyond just citation networks and publications, to really connect people based on their interests. A really interesting use case we looked at a few years ago, the technology wasn't there yet, but is just the idea of how do I connect with engineers or doctors or nurses in a disaster if I'm looking to rapidly try to mobilize people with different professional background. And if you think about the fact that we have the data on everybody who is a licensed doctor or a licensed nurse, we have licensing databases that tell us who people are. We have bio sketches, we have credentialing information. There is the potential for us to be able to target people to participate in new ways, even something like just how would I reach and find all the teachers if I wanted to ask a question. So to me, it's a really interesting question that I'm quite fascinated by, but I think it's you know, we don't have answers yet. we have a lot of questions.
Talking about participation, I would like to ask a question myself. Wouldn't we try to basically get the opinion of the people that never participates, because a lot of people that will participate anyway, that are active, but maybe many people don't have the opportunity to speak, and we should listen to them.
So that's where these, what are sometimes called mini publics, sometimes called citizen juries, citizen assemblies, those are all just names for soliciting a representative sample. So, you know, the idea of working with creating a panel, you know, survey research firms have panels of representative samples. So the idea of being able to marry representation to new forms of participation and new forms of information processing is really interesting. So this company, Remesh, that I mentioned before, they work, I don't know always whom they work with. It might be NORC or at the University of Chicago or another group that helps to create a representative sample. And then they take that representative sample and they layer on top of that the tools to make it faster to analyze what people are saying. So the representative sample is one technique. I think new forms of push that enable us to reach people and invite them to participate, to push out to them the opportunity and pull their participation in. It's where sentiment analysis is really interesting, because passive forms of information gathering, there's a very small number of people who actually want to go to a government agency and participate. There's a much larger number of people who want to go on Twitter and complain. And there are others, so the notion of, are there conversations happening in other places that we could analyze, you know, that could be useful for informing how we make policy and how we govern, is really, really interesting. And I think we're seeing, again, lots of self-organized, you know, forget about government, a lot of public problem solving is happening by crowdsourced bottom-up activity, but the same kinds of information processing is really, really useful. So yes, but it's why I think it's marrying multiple forms of engagement.
Eduardo?
Yeah, hi. First of all, great talk, and you know, welcome to Northeastern. I love the talk. I think there was a lot of things that you said about summarized data and so forth that are extremely interesting, but I have some questions sort of at a meta level, you know, the thinking big part of it. So, you know, you brought up the fact that people don't have time to analyze issues, and we see this over and over again. It could be in a condo association even, you know, a meeting happens, people explain why you have to have, you know, higher, you know, assessments, and then, you know, half the people didn't show up, and then they complain, why didn't you let me participate in this? Okay, so I'd like to understand how do you see that? But let me just sort of continue a more general question. How do you deal, so there'll be sub questions in here. How do you deal with the issue of misinformation? In particular, for example, you could see easily, if you want to eliminate duplications, there could be an AI machine that helps people submit duplicates that don't really look like duplicates. One day, if your algorithm is open source, somebody will come up with a counter algorithm to to try to cheat it, just like with spam. A related issue is generally sort of trust. I mean, how do you deal with the fact that people don't trust what they read anymore if it is not in their bubble? And finally, you mentioned the Chilean constitution, and I think that's a very interesting example of outliers. And I would like to hear your views on whether what happened there was that the people that really got elected to this crowdsourced idea of a citizen-written constitution were in fact a set of outliers. And you may disagree with that, but I like, so there's a lot of questions here.
Oof. With 4 minutes to go, and now I'm going to forget half of the questions there. So rain check on some of that. I will not do a good job at responding to this. I think in the end, you know, I'm not Chilean, so we have to defer maybe to the local experts on this. But I would say in the end, you know, the Chilean process, you know, fell to a lot of the same. I mean, it wasn't about the crowdsourcing kinds of stuff that happened early in the process. This was a bog standard traditional referendum, which was then subject to a lot of interest group pressures and disinformation, misinformation campaigns in the effort to sway the vote. So it would be really interesting, you know, there's comparative research on what's happened in Iceland, or even I see Laura here from Mexico. Mexico City crowdsourced its constitution with much more success, I think, in terms of the actual sort of listening to the people part worked really best. Constitution drafting is also a really, really specifically hard case. I think that is by itself an outlier, because the notion of trying to create one page or one page is really difficult, as opposed to looking at sort of more granular, more specific issues. The trust issue and disinformation, I deliberately left off the whole discussion about disinformation and misinformation because it's such a huge problem by itself. But I should have, put it as a kind of gating. It's a sort of baseline question with that we have to answer in parallel. But I think what we've seen is lots of instances of how, for example, these kind of designed engagement projects are really helpful at combating disinformation. So if you look at the work of somebody like Jim Fishkin, the deliberative polling work he's done at Stanford over many, many years has been about creating the conditions in which citizens are given high quality information. It's also something that I'm going to blank on his name, at Penn State has written about a lot, which is the citizen councils out of Oregon, which are about creating environments in which citizens are given kind of high quality information, allowed to deliberate with one another. I think his work doesn't go far enough because it's mainly focused on measuring how public opinion changes instead of actually using that public input for actual decision making. So what's really interesting, though, is how do we design these conditions? And I will say, just in the interest of time, where I see the opportunities around AI and machine learning is to make these project designs just so much more efficient. Because again, there's so much will out there to build more participatory engagement, and such limits in terms of the know-how and ability of organizations, whether it's governments or companies or nonprofits, to do this in any kind of efficient way. So we are starting a new project with a grant from the Walton Foundation that we're calling our Equitable Engagement Lab, where we have agreed to organize public engagements for using new technology for 6 grantees of the foundation. And our pitch to the foundation is, this is a pilot that you should be allowing us to organize engagements for everybody that you fund. You should fund people and then gross it up with a small grant to enable engagement to be married to every kind of research project that you fund. So that's a big claim that we're making, and we won't be able to do this without collaboration from people to help us figure out how to make this more efficient, which is what we're trying to do. So I know we're out of time, and I'm sorry that we didn't get to all the questions. So I put my email address in the chat, and Ken, I think if you're still there, please drop me a line, and if you can spell my last name, you can reach me. Noveck at Northeastern, Noveck at the Gov Lab, Noveck at Gmail. You'll find me if you can spell it. That's the only hurdle.
In the last 30 seconds, Beth, let me give another factor to Eduardo's question about Chile, because I'm a Chilean, and this may be important for the participation part of your talk. Is when you have a referendum, typically you have a single question. A constitution is like 50 questions at the same time. You just need one very sensitive question for you that you want to say no, and you say no. And I think this is the main factor of what happened in Chile for me, because plus fake news and manipulation of people, you get one no, and then the majority will say no. So Beth, thank you for an amazing talk. I think you opened so many doors to what we can do at the Institute. I'm sure we'll get back to you in the future. Thank you.
I would like that very much, and I know I'm affiliated with the Institute, but since I was not local, I wasn't able to come to as many things. But now I'm in the Boston area, so I'm looking forward to connecting with people over coffee as well as email.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you all. Bye. Thank you.